The manila envelope landed on Sarah Chen's doormat on a Tuesday morning in late March, pristine and ominous, like something out of a legal thriller. She was carrying her coffee, her third of the day, and almost didn't notice it. Almost, but she did. The envelope was thick, official. The kind of thing that made her stomach drop before she even opened it. Sarah had lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 7 years. 7 good years, mostly. She'd bought the modest 3-bedroom ranch house after her divorce, poured her heart into the garden, rebuilt her life in this quiet suburban pocket of northeastern Ohio. Her neighbors had been cordial if distant. They were the type of people who waved from their cars but never stopped to chat. The type who kept their lawns immaculate and their opinions to themselves, or so she thought. She set the coffee down on the kitchen counter and opened the envelope with a butter knife, her hands suddenly unsteady. Official notice of violation, the header screamed in aggressive serif font. It was from Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, addressed to Ms. Sarah Chen, 447 Willow Court, her property. Her hands trembled as she read, "Dear Ms. Chen, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that you are currently maintaining poultry, specifically 4 live chickens on your residential property in violation of Section 4.2 of the Meadowbrook Heights Community Guidelines, which explicitly prohibits the keeping of livestock of any kind." Sarah sat down heavily on one of her kitchen stools, the letter dangling from her fingers like it might burn her. She'd gotten the chickens 3 months ago. 3 months, she'd researched everything: local ordinances, breeds, housing requirements. The county allowed backyard chickens. Her property was zoned residential, but the county regulations explicitly permitted up to 12 hens without a special permit. She'd documented all of this. She'd followed the law. But she hadn't anticipated the HOA. The notice continued, detailing a fine of $250 for the first violation, an additional $50 per day if the violation continued, and in bold, failure to comply within 14 days will result in escalated enforcement action and further penalties. Sarah read the signature at the bottom. Patricia Hallbrook, President, Meadowbrook Heights HOA Board. She didn't know Patricia Hallbrook. Not really. They'd crossed paths at the community center's annual meeting last fall, a polished woman in her 60s with an immaculate bob and the bearing of someone who'd never been told no in her life. Sarah remembered her because Patricia had dominated the meeting, steering every decision toward stricter enforcement of existing rules, proposing new ones, shooting down any suggestions that didn't align with her vision of community standards. Sarah had said nothing during that meeting. She'd sat in the back and listened to Patricia talk about keeping property values up, maintaining the character of our community, preventing the neighborhood from going downhill like so many others. Sarah had found it exhausting and a little sad, the way Patricia seemed to derive her sense of purpose from controlling what other people did on their own property. Now, Patricia was trying to control what Sarah did with her chickens. She read the notice a second time, looking for any loophole, any ambiguity she could exploit. But it was clearly written. Section 4.2 was explicit: no livestock, not even clarifications about small quantities or heritage breeds or the minimal noise and smell produced by well-maintained hens. Just no livestock. Sarah's chickens, Penny, Dimes, Quarters, and Nicole, were currently in the run in her backyard, pecking at the ground in the morning sun. They'd been the reason she'd managed to smile through the worst winter of her life. Her therapist had suggested finding a hobby, something that would engage her hands and her mind. Sarah had taken up gardening more seriously and gotten the chickens on a whim after a particularly difficult day in February, when everything felt gray and purposeless. The chickens had changed things. They were alive in a way that required her attention and presence. She collected their eggs, usually 3 or 4 a day, and used them in her baking. She'd started selling lemon bars at the farmer's market again, something she'd loved doing before the divorce had consumed her entire existence. For the first time in 2 years, people were asking her how she was doing and actually waiting for the answer. Her neighbor Jeff had waved to her from his fence line just last week and said, "Those are nice birds. My kids love watching them." Jeff had a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. They'd been glued to the fence every afternoon for the past month, laughing at the chickens' antics. And now Patricia Hallbrook wanted them gone. Sarah's first instinct was to comply. It was the sensible thing to do. She could sell the chickens. There was probably someone at the farmer's market who'd take them. She could dismantle the landscape over the space, pretend the last 3 months hadn't happened. But something in her resisted that impulse. Something that felt like the part of herself that had learned to push back during her marriage. The part that had finally said, enough, when enough was genuinely enough. The part that had moved into this house alone, without permission or encouragement or a cosigner. Sarah set the letter down and pulled out her laptop. She started with the HOA bylaws and covenants, which she'd received when she bought the property but never fully absorbed. She dug through the county regulations, finding the explicit exemption for backyard poultry. She researched similar cases in her state. There were several, and in most of them, the homeowners had won or reached settlements. She read about HOA authority and limitations. She learned about the difference between enforceable restrictions and those that conflicted with municipal code. The more she read, the clearer it became. The HOA's restriction on livestock was almost certainly designed to prevent someone from keeping a horse, a cow, a pig, actual large animals that could genuinely impact property values and neighborhood character. 4 backyard hens, that wasn't livestock. That was sustainable living. That was urban farming. That was something increasingly common in suburban areas across the country, and more importantly, it conflicted with county ordinance. In most cases, municipal code trumped HOA restrictions. By noon, Sarah had filled 3 pages of notes. She'd flagged specific sections of county code, printed out case precedent, and documented her chicken's minimal impact with photos and videos. She'd even measured the distance from her coop to the nearest property line and neighbor window, proving they were well-maintained and set far back on her property. Then she called a lawyer. Attorney David Hartley worked out of a small office in downtown Akron and had a specialization in HOA disputes. Sarah found him through a legal aid website and managed to schedule a consultation call for that evening. She couldn't afford much. Her freelance graphic design work had picked up after the divorce, but it was steady rather than lucrative. But she was determined to at least understand her options. David was patient and careful. He listened to her entire story without interrupting, and when she finished, he took a long breath. "Okay," he said. "Here's the situation. The HOA is almost certainly overstepping. Ohio Municipal Code is very clear about backyard chickens. The county where you live explicitly permits them. Generally, when there's a conflict between HOA restrictions and municipal code, the municipal code wins. You have a strong legal position." "So they can't find me?" Sarah asked, hope rising in her chest. "They can try, but if they enforce it against you and you fight back, which you should, you have a very good chance of winning. However," he paused, "here's where it gets complicated. HOAs can be vindictive. They can fine you repeatedly. They can put liens on your property. It becomes expensive and stressful to fight them even if you're right, and some people give up before they get their day in court." Sarah's stomach sank slightly. "How expensive if it goes to litigation?" $5,000 to $15,000 depending on how complicated it gets. If you settle or they back off, much less, but there's no way to guarantee that right now. "What should I do?" "First," David said, "I'd send them a formal letter, point out the county ordinance, cite the relevant code sections, explain that their restriction is unenforceable. I'll draft something for you and we can have it sent on letterhead." That alone sometimes makes HOAs reconsider because they realize the homeowner is serious and informed. "If they back off, great. If they don't," he trailed off. "Then we talk about next steps." Sarah agreed to his fee, $300 for the letter, and that night she barely slept. She kept getting up to look out the window at the chicken run, as if her chickens might have already been seized in the night by some HOA enforcement squad. The formal letter from David's office arrived on Friday. It was professionally devastating. 8 pages of carefully constructed argument, statutes cited, and precedent. At the end, it stated clearly, "The HOA's enforcement of Section 4.2 against Ms. Chen's poultry is not merely questionable. It is legally unenforceable and potentially grounds for a countersuit if pursued." That was bluffing, David had admitted to Sarah. They probably didn't have grounds for a countersuit. But HOAs didn't like being sued, even small ones, and they liked being told they were violating the law even less. Sarah sent the letter on Monday morning. She heard back by Wednesday. The second letter was shorter and significantly less friendly. It came from Patricia Holbrook directly, no letterhead, just Patricia's elegant, angular handwriting on cream-colored cardstock with her name embossed at the top. "Sarah," it began as if they were friends, "I received your attorney's letter. I'm disappointed that you felt the need to involve legal counsel over this matter. It's a simple rule designed to maintain the character and value of our community. Many homeowners would be grateful for the guidance. However, I can see that you feel strongly about this. I'm willing to meet with you to discuss your situation. Perhaps we can find a mutually agreeable solution. I'd like to invite you to have coffee with me this Saturday at Rosewood Cafe. 10 a.m. Come alone, please. I think we can work this out between neighbors, best." Sarah read the letter 3 times, searching for subtext. There was so much subtext. The phrase, "many homeowners would be grateful," was a clear message. You're being ungrateful. You're being difficult. You're not like the good neighbors. The "alone, please" was more ominous. Don't bring your lawyer. Don't bring witnesses. Let's settle this quietly the way I want to settle it. But there was also something else in the letter, a shift. Patricia was no longer certain. She was trying a new tactic, pivoting from authority to friendship. That meant David's letter had worked. She knew she might not win if this went to court. Sarah texted David. She wants to meet. Is that a good idea? His response came back within minutes. Could be, don't agree to anything, just listen. But bring your phone and record if it's legal in your state. It is in Ohio. And afterward, send me a detailed summary. Don't let her gaslight you into thinking you've done something wrong. Sarah agreed to the meeting. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. Sarah dressed carefully, not too formal, not too casual. She wanted to look like someone who was serious but reasonable. She showed up exactly at 10 a.m., which meant Patricia was already there, seated at a small table by the window with a cappuccino and a carefully constructed expression of warm friendliness that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, thank you so much for coming. Patricia stood and reached out to embrace Sarah, who awkwardly returned the hug, hyper-aware of her phone in her back pocket, recording. They sat. Patricia ordered a latte for Sarah without asking if she wanted one, a small power move that Sarah noted and filed away. Want to start by saying, Patricia began, that I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a good person who made an impulsive decision without fully understanding the community you live in. Here we go, Sarah thought. Meadowbrook Heights is special, Patricia continued, stirring her cappuccino with a small silver spoon. We've maintained a standard here that keeps property values stable and the community desirable. When people move here, they're investing in that standard. They're trusting us, the HOA board, to maintain it. When one resident decides to do something unconventional, it sends a message to everyone else that the standards don't matter anymore. It's a slippery slope. Chickens are backyard poultry, Sarah said quietly. They're legal in the county, they're sustainable. They're becoming increasingly common in suburban areas across the country. I don't think they're sending a message that standards don't matter. Tricia smiled, and it was the smile of someone who's had this conversation many times before and knows exactly where it's going. You'd be surprised how upset some residents have been. We've received 3 complaints about your chickens. Sarah's eyebrows rose. 3 complaints. She hadn't even considered that neighbors might have complained. She'd thought Jeff, her fence-adjacent neighbor, was delighted. She'd waved to other neighbors dozens of times while tending the coop. She'd naively assumed that chickens would be a non-controversial addition to her backyard. Whom? Sarah asked. I can't share specific residents' information, Patricia said smoothly. But I can tell you that people are concerned. They're worried about rats. They're worried about noise. They're worried about the aesthetic impact. My chickens haven't caused any of those things, Sarah said. They're kept in a secure coop. The noise is minimal, less than most barking dogs. The aesthetic is actually quite pleasant. That's your perspective, Patricia said. But property values are subjective. If enough residents perceive an issue, it becomes a real one perception-wise. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a hardening of resolve. Patricia, I looked at the county ordinance. I consulted a lawyer. The HOA's restriction on livestock conflicts with municipal code. Technically, you can't enforce it against me. My attorney's letter explained that. Patricia's smile thinned. Your attorney's letter was heavy-handed and somewhat threatening. It's not the approach a good neighbor takes. I didn't want to take a legal approach at all, Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. But when someone sends you a fine notice, it forces you into that position. The notice was a formality. An attempt to work through proper channels. The notice was threatening. It said I'd be fined $50 a day if I didn't comply. That's how violations work. It's not a valid violation because the county allows chickens. Patricia set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Sarah, I'm going to be very direct with you. I've been president of this HOA for 8 years. I care deeply about this community. And I've learned that sometimes what's legal and what's right for the community are 2 different things. The letter of the law isn't always the spirit of the law, if you understand me. Sarah understood her perfectly. Patricia was saying, the law doesn't matter if I decide it doesn't matter. I'm the authority here. I decide what happens in this community. I understand, Sarah said, but I think the law is the only thing that should matter. If you want to change the HOA rules, that's a process that involves the whole community, not just you. But you can't selectively enforce rules that are against municipal code. Patricia's jaw tightened. Is that what your attorney told you to say? No, that's what I believe. What do you think will happen if you don't remove those chickens? I think, Sarah said carefully, that if you try to fine me, I'll fight it in court, and I think I'll win. So the question is this really the battle you want to fight? For just a moment, barely a flash, something ugly crossed Patricia's face. Anger, contempt, the expression of someone who wasn't used to being defied. Then the smile was back, but it was different now, colder. Sarah, I hope you really think about what you're doing. Legal battles are unpleasant. They're costly, even for the winner. They cause stress. They tear apart communities. I'd hate to see you go through that. especially over something as small as 4 chickens. Then withdraw the fine, Sarah said. And we won't have to, Patricia laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. You know what? No, I'm done being nice about this. You want to fight, we'll fight. You have 14 days from the original notice to remove those chickens. After that, the fines increase to $100 a day, and we'll be documenting everything. If this goes to court, the judge will see that you were given multiple opportunities to resolve this amicably, and you chose confrontation instead. That's not fair, Sarah said quietly. Fair? Patricia leaned forward. Fair is maintaining standards in a community people moved to specifically because of those standards. Fair is protecting property values. Fair is me working 40 hours a week as a volunteer to manage this community, and then having people like you decide that the rules don't apply to them. That's what fair is. Sarah gathered her things. The coffee that had arrived sat untouched on the table, already cooling. I hope you lose, Patricia said quietly, almost to herself, as Sarah stood to leave. Sarah left without responding. But she made sure her phone had captured every word of it. That evening, she sent David the recording. His response came back within an hour. This is good. This actually works in your favor. She's clearly antagonistic and emotionally invested in this in a way that damages her credibility. She also explicitly stated she's aware of the county ordinance issue and is choosing to override it anyway. That's overreach. Keep this safe. Sarah spent the rest of the weekend in a state of agitated research. She looked up Ohio HOA law. She looked up cases where HOAs had been ruled to have exceeded their authority. She read about people who'd successfully challenged HOA restrictions. She joined an online forum for HOA disputes and told her story. What surprised her most was how many people responded. Dozens of stories. HOA boards overstepping. Boards retaliating against homeowners who challenged them. Boards fining people into financial ruin because they refused to back down. One woman wrote, "They put a lien on my house because of an alleged violation I never actually committed. It took me 3 years and $20,000 to clear it. By then, the lien had tanked my credit score. I couldn't refinance, couldn't sell, couldn't do anything. Eventually, the board president admitted in a deposition that she'd never actually investigated whether my violation was real. She just didn't like me. These people operate with almost no oversight." Sarah realized, sitting on her couch late Sunday night, that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the principle. If she gave in, she'd be validating Patricia's overreach. She'd be confirming that the HOA could bend the rules whenever they wanted to, could selectively enforce or ignore municipal code depending on their personal preferences. But if she fought and won, it would mean something different. It would mean that property rights mattered. It would mean that the letter of the law, the thing that had freed her and guided her through her divorce and kept her standing, actually meant something. She didn't sleep well that night either. By Monday morning, Patricia escalated. The second official notice came via registered mail. Sarah had to sign for it, and her hands were shaking as the delivery driver waited for her signature. She opened it immediately, right there at the mailbox. It was worse than the first notice. This one was from Patricia's lawyer, a real lawyer, not just HOA letterhead. It stated that Sarah had been formally notified of the violation, had failed to comply within the specified time, and that additional fines totaling $150 had now been assessed, the original $250 plus $50 per day for 3 days. It also stated that the HOA was considering whether to place a lien on her property if the violation and fines were not resolved immediately. A lien. On her house. The house she'd spent 7 years rebuilding her life in. House that was paid off, that was hers. Sarah called David, and her voice was shaking. "Okay," David said, calm as always. "This is actually good news in a weird way. This is escalation. This is Patricia showing that she's willing to go way too far. We can use this. But Sarah, I need to tell you something. If you want to back down now, that's still an option. The cost to you right now is minimal compared to what it could become. I don't want you to feel trapped." "I'm not backing down," Sarah said. "I'm angry." "Good, stay angry, but stay smart. Let's file a legal challenge to the HOA's authority. I'll prepare something for filing this week. But Sarah, I want to warn you, once we file, things might get more contentious. Patricia might decide to go nuclear." "What does that look like?" "It means she might try to turn the board against you. She might get others involved in the enforcement. She might try to make your life as difficult as possible before you have your day in court. It's not illegal exactly, but it's how some people respond to being challenged." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said finally, "do it." That night, Sarah did something she hadn't done since her divorce. She called her mother. Her mother, Diana, who lived in California and had never quite approved of Sarah's decision to move to Ohio after the split, who thought Sarah should come back to the West Coast and start fresh, who had nonetheless sent her a card every month for the first year just with a one-line message of encouragement. Honey, what's wrong? Deanna answered, because apparently mothers have a sixth sense for crisis. Sarah told her everything. The chickens, Patricia, the notices, the legal threat, the lien, the whole thing. She told her about the divorce, too, context that Diana already knew but that Sarah felt the need to frame. I did this because I was trying to rebuild, because I needed to feel like I had agency again. Diana listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, there was a long silence. That woman, Diana said finally, is going to regret ever messing with you. What do you mean? I mean, honey, you're my daughter. You're the one who read the entire employee handbook and found the clause that allowed you to negotiate a remote position during your separation because everyone else in your office didn't think it was possible. You're the one who planned a divorce for 2 years before pulling the trigger because you wanted to be absolutely certain. You don't do anything without thinking it through. So if you've decided to fight this, Patricia Holbrook has made a huge mistake. Despite everything, Sarah smiled. I'm scared, Mom. Of course you are. Do it anyway. David filed the legal challenge on Wednesday. By Friday, Patricia had responded with an emergency motion to increase fines and expedite the resolution process. The board was backing her. Whatever 3 residents had complained, they'd apparently talked the rest of the board into supporting Patricia's escalation. Sarah received notice of a special board meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, where her case would be heard. She was invited to present her position to the board. That's when she decided to record it. Not just audio, but video. She wanted it documented. She wanted there to be witnesses, even if just cameras. That's when she decided to invite the news. End of part 1. Sarah Chen stood in her backyard, hands shaking as she drafted an email to the local ABC affiliate. She'd crossed a line. She knew it the moment she pressed send. This wasn't a legal dispute anymore. This was a public one. Whatever happened next, everyone would know about it. Part 2. The escalation. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, the cursor blinking in the email compose field. She drafted and deleted the message to Channel 5 News at least a dozen times. Each version sounded progressively more dramatic, more pleading, more like she was trying to manipulate them into covering her story. But that's exactly what she was trying to do. The truth was simpler and more desperate than all her carefully crafted versions. Sarah needed witnesses who weren't connected to the HOA, people who would care about fairness and overreach, people whose presence at the Tuesday board meeting would prevent Patricia and her allies from doing anything too aggressive. She needed the situation to become too public for them to just quietly destroy her. She finally settled on something between neutral and, whom it may concern. My name is Sarah Chen, and I live in Meadowbrook Heights in City. I'm writing because I believe there's a story here about homeowners association overreach and the conflict between municipal code and HOA enforcement. I have a healthy backyard chicken coop that's legal under county ordinance, but my HOA is threatening me with fines and liens for keeping them. The situation has escalated significantly and unusually quickly, and I have documentation suggesting potential abuse of HOA authority. I'm happy to provide more details. If your station would be interested in covering this, I'm prepared to cooperate fully. Thank you, Sarah Chen. Phone number. She hit send before she could reconsider again. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. A producer named Marcus called her within 2 hours. He had a smooth, professional voice and a series of rapid-fire questions that suggested he was either very interested or very bored but had been assigned the task anyway. Walk me through the timeline, he said. Start to finish. Sarah did, laying out each step. The notice, the lawyer's letter, the coffee meeting, Patricia's escalation, the registered mail, the board hearing scheduled for Tuesday. You have this on recording? Marcus asked. Coffee meeting, yes. The HOA letters, all of them. I photographed the originals and have the scans. The county ordinance permits backyard poultry, explicitly. I can send you the specific code sections. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. Okay, Marcus said. Here's what I'm thinking. This could be interesting, but it's not news yet. You know, it's a local HOA dispute. We get these all the time. But if your HOA takes some kind of action at this Tuesday meeting, if they actually try to put through increased fines, if they move forward with the lien, something concrete and demonstrable, then we've got something. We've got overreach. We've got a board abusing their authority. That's a story. Sarah's heart sank slightly. So you won't cover the meeting? I didn't say that. I'm saying we might send a crew if the meeting sounds like it's going to be contentious and significant, but I can't promise it. Send me those code sections and your documentation. Let me look it over, and call me the night before the meeting. We'll decide then if it's worth our time. After they hung up, Sarah sat in silence. She'd hoped for a concrete commitment, but what she got was a maybe. Oh, we'll see if this is interesting enough from a news producer who covered everything from city council meetings to human interest stories and had to pick and choose based on what would attract viewers. She needed to make it more interesting. That night, she did something she'd been avoiding. She read all the HOA complaints that were now part of the official record in her legal file. David had sent them over. They'd been subpoenaed as part of the legal discovery process, so they were legally obtainable. The first complaint was from someone named Robert Hutchins, who lived 5 houses down. His complaint alleged that the chickens posed a rat and pest infestation risk, and that his children were frightened by the bird sounds early in the morning. Second was from Margaret Voss, who lived 2 doors over in the opposite direction. Her complaint focused on unsightly coop construction and claimed that the chickens were a public nuisance and eyesore. Third was from someone Sarah didn't recognize at all, Thomas Weir, who she realized must live across the street. His complaint was the most vague: general concern about community standards and property value impact. Sarah did something she probably shouldn't have done. She Googled each of them. Robert Hutchins worked in commercial real estate. She found his LinkedIn profile, which contained a photo of him in a suit that looked professionally taken, with a biography full of bullet points about his accomplishments and market knowledge. Margaret Voss had an older website for her personal brand as an interior designer. Sarah looked at her portfolio, gorgeous homes, all very high-end and minimalist. Margaret's aesthetic didn't seem compatible with anything she'd consider pastoral or rustic. Thomas Weir seemed to be a retired accountant who now spent his time golfing and posting about golf on social media. The thing they had in common: none of them had ever spoken to Sarah directly about the chickens. None of them had knocked on her door or left a note or even waved awkwardly at the fence. They'd gone straight to the HOA with their complaints, gone straight to Patricia, which meant Patricia had possibly solicited these complaints, or at least hadn't discouraged them. Or at least had encouraged people who were already upset to formalize their grievances. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity of anger, cold and purposeful. She called David back. "Need to know something," she said. "Can I contact these people?" "You can," David said cautiously, "but I'd advise against it. Anything you say could be used against you. Anything they say could be weaponized." "What if I just want to understand why they complained?" "Sarah, I hear you. But right now, you're in a legal dispute. Every conversation is potentially evidence. Every email, every text, every phone call could end up in a courtroom. You need to assume that anything you do is going to be used somehow." Sarah understood what he was saying, but she'd also learned over the course of her divorce that sometimes the only way to understand an opponent's position was to hear it directly. She called Robert Hutchins the next morning at 9, a time she calculated would catch him before he got into his workday. A woman answered, presumably his wife or partner. "Hi," Sarah said. "Is this the Hutchins residence? I'm calling about Robert. My name is Sarah Chen. I live at 447 Willow Court." There was a pause, the sound of the phone being muffled, a brief conversation in the background. Robert came on the line. His voice was cautious. "Yes. Hi, Robert. I'm calling because you filed a complaint about my backyard chickens, and I wanted to understand your concerns directly. I think there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't think there's anything to discuss," Robert said, and she could hear something in his voice, not anger exactly, but discomfort. "The HOA is handling it." "I understand that, but I'm wondering if you'd be willing to actually come see the coop, to see how it's set up, how it's maintained. I think you might find that the things you're concerned about, the rats, the noise, aren't actually issues. I don't know you, and I don't really care about your chickens. It's just about following the rules. The rules conflict with the county ordinance. Not interested in having this conversation." He hung up. Sarah stared at her phone. That had been a mistake. It had probably confirmed in Robert's mind that she was unreasonable and aggressive. She'd put him on the defensive, and now he'd certainly doubled down with Patricia. She called Margaret Voss next with a similar script and got a similar result. A polite but firm, "I don't want to discuss this," and the phone disconnecting. She didn't bother calling Thomas Weir. David called her late Tuesday morning, the day of the hearing. "Have you gotten any other communication from the HOA?" he asked. "No, why?" "Because Patricia Hallbrook sent us a letter this morning. It's aggressive. She's claiming that your contact with the complainants constitutes harassment. She's threatening to file a police report." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "But I just called and asked them to." "I know. It wasn't harassment, but she's framing it that way. She's also claiming that your decision to contact the media is an attempt to intimidate the HOA board. She's threatening defamation claims if any false statements are made in news coverage." "I haven't made false statements." "I know. And I'm not worried about the defamation threat. That won't go anywhere. But I want to warn you, Patricia is in litigation mode now. She's scared people escalate. The hearing tonight is going to be contentious." "Should I even go?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Absolutely, you should go, and bring a notebook, document everything. Write down who said what verbatim if you can, take photos and video if it's permitted, make a record of this. After they hung up, Sarah sat on her couch and tried to breathe through the anxiety spiraling in her chest. She'd crossed a line by calling the neighbors. She'd made Patricia think she was aggressive, unreasonable, dangerous even. And now the whole thing was accelerating in ways she couldn't control. She called Marcus at Channel 5. "Is there any chance you'd send a crew tonight?" she asked without preamble. "The HOA hearing is at 7 p.m. and I think it's going to get heated." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Where's the meeting?" Meadowbrook Heights Community Center, 500 Oak Drive. "You expect confrontation." "I expect my HOA president to come at me hard. She's threatened legal action. She's trying to paint me as a harasser. It's getting ugly." "Okay," Marcus said. "Let me see what we can do. No promises, but if I can pull a crew off another assignment, we might be able to swing it. The time works. 7 p.m. is good for us. We could potentially run it on the late news. Call me at 5 p.m. and I'll let you know for sure." Sarah hung up with a fragile thread of hope running through her chest. She arrived at the community center at 6:45 p.m., 15 minutes early. The parking lot was nearly full, which was surprising. Apparently word had gotten around, or Patricia had made sure that board members and their allies all showed up. Sarah sat in her car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. She'd worn dark jeans and a navy blazer over a white shirt, professional but not overdone. She'd tied her hair back in a ponytail. She'd done her makeup carefully, enough to look composed, not so much that she'd look like she was trying too hard. She was performing the role of reasonable person, and she needed the performance to be convincing. At 6:55, she called Marcus. "Are you coming?" "We're on our way," Marcus said. "We'll be there in about 5 minutes. We'll set up in the back of the meeting space. Don't acknowledge us, don't change your behavior because we're there. Just do what you would do normally." Sarah said, though her hands were shaking now. She saw the news van pull into the parking lot at 6:58, Channel 5 emblazoned on its side in blue and white. 2 people got out: Marcus, who she recognized from a Google image search, and a cameraman with professional equipment. Sarah's heart was racing. This was real now. This was officially public. She got out of her car and walked into the community center, her legs feeling oddly disconnected from the rest of her body. The meeting room was set up with the HOA board in front, 5 people seated at a long table on a small raised platform, and folding chairs arranged in rows facing them. The room was surprisingly full. Sarah counted maybe 30 people, and a quick scan suggested that a lot of them were her neighbors. Some looked sympathetic, others looked hostile. Patricia was seated in the center chair, looking sharp in a gray blazer, her hair perfect, her expression professionally composed. On her right was Derek Simmons, an older man who worked in commercial development. On her left was Jennifer Walsh, a woman Sarah had never really spoken to. To Derek's right was Robert Hutchins. He'd actually made it onto the board, which Sarah hadn't known. And on the far right was Maria Rodriguez, the only board member Sarah recognized as having voted against some of Patricia's more aggressive proposals in past meetings. The cameraman had set up in the back left corner, and while he wasn't exactly hidden, he wasn't obvious either. Most of the people in the room hadn't noticed him yet, or if they had, they didn't seem to register what he was. Patricia's eyes, however, swept across the room and landed directly on the camera. Her expression didn't change, but Sarah saw her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. It was 7:03 when Patricia called the meeting to order. "Before we begin," Patricia said, her voice carrying the careful tones of someone conducting official business, "I need to address the presence of media in this room. This is a private HOA meeting, and while our bylaws permit homeowners to attend, the presence of cameras and journalists is not standard procedure. I'm going to ask the media representative to leave." Marcus stood up from the front row, where he'd apparently migrated while Sarah wasn't looking. "I'm with Channel 5 News," he said conversationally. "We're here as observers like any member of the public, unless you're explicitly banning all press from HOA meetings, which I'd note would be unusual and potentially problematic from a First Amendment perspective. We have a right to be here." Patricia's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is a private organization, but you're conducting business that affects publicly available property records and municipal governance. The meeting is being held in a public facility, and we're not disrupting anything. We're just documenting." For a moment, Patricia looked like she might push back harder. Then she seemed to calculate the optics of forcibly removing a news crew and apparently decided it wasn't worth it. "Fine," she said coldly. "But no photography or video without explicit consent of all parties. It's in our bylaws." "Actually," Marcus said pleasantly, "this is a public meeting in a semi-public space. We're allowed to record, but we'll be respectful about it." Patricia's lips thinned into something that approximated a smile. "Let's proceed then." She looked toward Sarah, who was sitting in the third row, alone, surrounded by the empty space of other people's deliberate distance. Sarah Chen is here regarding the violations documented on her property. Sarah, you're welcome to address the board first. You have 5 minutes. Sarah stood, her legs unsteady. She'd prepared something, but looking at Patricia's face, at the board members' expressions ranging from sympathetic Maria to hostile Robert, she decided to abandon her notes and speak from something more honest. Appreciate the opportunity to address the board, Sarah began, her voice steadier than she felt. I moved to Meadowbrook Heights 7 years ago because I wanted a home, a place to build a life. I've been a good neighbor. I've maintained my property. I've followed the rules that are actually enforceable under Ohio law. Chickens I keep are protected under county ordinance. That ordinance explicitly allows backyard poultry. It supersedes HOA restrictions when there's a conflict. That's how the law works. But beyond the legal issue, I need to say this. I'm not asking for permission to do something harmful or inappropriate. I'm asking for the basic right to maintain a sustainable household on property I own. The chickens have affected no one negatively. They produce eggs for my family. They've been something meaningful during a difficult time in my life. And what I've seen from the HOA since I got the first notice is not a good faith discussion about community standards. It's been escalation. It's been threats. It's been a pattern of behavior that suggests this is personal rather than principled. I'm not asking the board to approve of my chickens. I'm asking the board to stop trying to find me for something that's legal and cause me no harm. That's not asking much. That's asking for reasonableness. Sarah sat down. Her hands were trembling and she clasped them together in her lap. There was a moment of silence. Then Patricia spoke. Thank you for your perspective, Sarah. However, the board has a responsibility to maintain community standards and... Actually, Maria Rodriguez interrupted. Can I ask something first? Patricia's jaw tightened. Of course. Sarah, have your chickens caused any actual problems, any documented complaints beyond the 3 we've received? No, Sarah said. Actively no, my next-door neighbor, Jeff Morrison, has expressed that he likes the chickens. His children watch them. The coop itself is well-maintained, Maria continued. Yes. I have photos and videos I'm happy to show the board. Maria looked at Patricia. Patricia, we received 3 complaints. None of them describe actual harm, no reports of escaped chickens, no livestock damage, no documented property value decline. They're speculative complaints about theoretical risks. Meanwhile, the county code explicitly permits backyard poultry. Why are we pursuing this? Because HOA restrictions can be stricter than municipal code, Patricia said sharply. We have the authority, do we? Maria asked. Or does municipal code supersede us in cases of conflict? I think that's a legal question we should actually get answered before we proceed. Researched it, Derek Simmons said, and Maria's right. In Ohio, municipal code generally trumps HOA restrictions when they conflict. That's been established in multiple court cases. Which is exactly why Sarah's attorney sent us the letter she did, Patricia said, and there was an edge in her voice now, an edge of desperation or anger. She's trying to bully us into submission by threatening litigation. I'm not going to be bullied. This isn't about being bullied, Maria said quietly. This is about following the law. If Sarah's right, and I think she is, then we need to stop. The board voted on this enforcement, Patricia said. We voted unanimously to proceed. I don't remember voting to escalate the way we have, Maria said. I remember voting to address a concern. I don't remember voting to threaten a lien on someone's house for keeping legal, compliant chickens. Tension in the room had shifted. It was palpable now, a public rift on the board that Patricia clearly hadn't anticipated. Robert Hutchins leaned forward. Patricia, I'm not sure where I came down on the escalation. We got those initial complaints, and it seemed like the thing to do. But hearing that it's legal under county code, he trailed off. I might have been too quick to support increased fines. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Are you backing away from your own complaint, Robert? I'm saying I might have made a complaint based on theoretical concerns rather than actual problems. That's different from supporting aggressive enforcement of an arguably illegal restriction. Patricia's control was visibly cracking. Sarah could see it in her face, in the way her hands had gone white-knuckled, gripping the edge of the table. Character of this community, Patricia began. Character of this community, Marcus said from the back of the room, speaking to his camera, is currently being tested by an HOA board majority that appears to be reconsidering its aggressive enforcement of potentially unenforceable restrictions against a homeowner exercising legal rights under municipal ordinance. This is a case that's gotten national attention, actually. We've received tips from people in 3 other states with similar situations. Would any board members care to comment on record? Patricia's face went gray. The camera, the press, the narrative now belonged to forces outside her control. "This meeting is adjourned," she said abruptly, standing up. "We'll reconvene with legal counsel present to determine our next steps. This is clearly a matter that requires legal review." But the damage was done. Maria and Derek were already looking at Sarah with something that approximated apology or at least recognition that the wrongness had been clear and obvious. Robert looked profoundly uncomfortable, like a man who'd been swept up in something and suddenly seen the current clearly. Sarah walked out of the community center into the cool evening, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might come out of her chest. Marcus was waiting outside with his camera crew. "That was incredible," he said. "Can we get a quick on-camera interview with you?" Sarah wanted to say no. She was shaking, exhausted, overwhelmed. But she also knew that the narrative mattered now. The board had been divided on camera. The community had seen conflict. The press was interested. The balance of power had shifted. "Okay," she said, "but just for 5 minutes." Marcus positioned her against the backdrop of the community center, the sun setting orange and pink behind her, the whole thing looking like a movie scene, which it basically was. "This is Marcus Webb with Channel 5, he said to the camera. "I'm here with Sarah Chen, a Meadowbrook Heights resident whose backyard chickens have triggered an escalating conflict with her HOA. Sarah, can you tell our viewers why this matters?" Sarah took a breath and spoke the truth as she understood it. "It matters because homeowners associations have a lot of power over people's private property, and that power isn't always properly checked. When an HOA board decides to enforce rules that conflict with municipal law, when they escalate to threats and liens rather than engaging in good faith, there's no real recourse unless you're willing to fight. And most people aren't willing to fight because it's exhausting and expensive. I was willing because I didn't have anything to lose except my peace of mind, and I'd already lost most of that anyway." Marcus was nodding, and Sarah realized he was asking a follow-up in her head. "What do you want people to know?" "I want people to know," Sarah continued, "that when something feels wrong, when you're being treated unfairly for doing something legal, it's okay to push back. It's okay to get a lawyer. It's okay to go public. It's okay to not be quiet about it, because the moment you're quiet is the moment they think they can get away with it." And as she said it, she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with HOAs and everything to do with the part of herself that had finally left her marriage. The part that had learned that silence wasn't peace, it was just slow suffocation. End of part 2 the next morning. The story ran on Channel 5's morning news at 6 a.m. By 9 a.m., it had been picked up by regional news networks. By noon, it was trending on social media. By evening, national news outlets were calling Marcus, asking for the full story. Patricia Hallbrook didn't answer her phone for 3 days. Part 3. The reckoning. The story went viral in a way Sarah hadn't anticipated and couldn't have prevented if she'd wanted to. She woke up Wednesday morning to 47 text messages, 32 emails, and 7 voicemails. Friends she hadn't heard from in years, acquaintances from college, her ex-husband, of all people, his message, "Saw you on the news, that was badass, good for you." And interview requests from news outlets she'd heard of but never expected to contact her, national news, NPR called, The Today Show called. A producer for a cable news network specializing in human interest stories wanted to fly her to New York to be on their primetime special about HOA abuses. Sarah sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee she'd made 6 times because she kept forgetting she'd already made it, trying to process the fact that her fight with an HOA over 4 backyard chickens had somehow become a news cycle. Her therapist had an appointment open at 10 a.m., and Sarah took it. "This is overwhelming," Dr. Reeves said, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. Dr. Reeves was a woman in her 60s with gray hair and the kind of presence that made you feel like you were the only person in the world while you were in her office. Sarah had been seeing her for 2 years, had spent probably $200,000 total on therapy throughout her divorce process, and had learned to trust Dr. Reeves's instincts as much as her own. "It's terrifying," Sarah corrected. I wanted the board to back off. I didn't want to become a news story. I don't want to be famous for arguing about chickens." "What do you want?" Dr. Reeves asked. Sarah thought about it. "I want the fine to be withdrawn. I want to keep my chickens. I want my neighbors to stop judging me. I want my life to go back to normal." "Those are reasonable things. I noticed the 4th thing on your list, going back to normal, might not be possible after this. Are you prepared for that?" "No," Sarah said. "I'm not. I was angry enough to fight, but I wasn't angry enough to burn my entire life down, which is what this feels like." "That what's happening?" Dr. Reeves asked gently. "Your life burning down?" "No," Sarah said after a moment. "Actually, I think what's happening is the opposite. My life is becoming real, actual. I'm existing in public now instead of in private. That's the scary part. But it's also somehow more honest than anything I've done in a long time." She declined the national interview requests. She was gracious about it, but firm. She'd done enough. She'd made her point. She wanted privacy, but Channel 5 was continuing with the story. Marcus called her Thursday morning with an update. The HOA board held an emergency meeting last night, he said. With legal counsel present, Patricia Holbrook resigned as president. Sarah felt something in her chest clench and release. She resigned, effective immediately. The board voted to withdraw the enforcement action against your chickens, retroactively remove all fines, and apologize to you on the record. There was a strange moment where Sarah felt like she might throw up. You there? Yeah, she managed. I'm here. How do you feel about that? I feel. Sarah paused, searching for the right word. Vindicated and sad. I didn't want her to lose her position. Even though she was behaving unethically. Yes, Sarah said. Even though. I think I understand now why people stay quiet about these things. Because fighting back has consequences for everyone, not just the person who was wrong. Patricia's probably humiliated. Her board members are probably mad at her for creating this mess. My neighbors, I don't know what they think anymore. Well, Marcus said, I can help with that if you want. We want to run a follow-up story, board's apology, formal withdrawal of fines, that kind of thing. You could set the record straight on what you actually wanted, which was just to keep your chickens, not to destroy anyone. Sarah thought about it. Okay, she said, but I want to do something else too. What? I want to talk to Patricia. Before any of this goes public, I want to hear her side of things. There was a pause. Marcus was probably surprised. Most people in her position wouldn't want to humanize their opponent. I can try to set that up, Marcus said finally. But she might not want to talk to you or to us. Anyway, Sarah said, Patricia agreed to meet, not with Marcus and not at a coffee shop where they could be photographed. But she agreed to a private conversation at Sarah's house on Friday evening. Sarah cleaned obsessively. She vacuumed and dusted and reorganized things that didn't need reorganizing. She made tea that she wasn't sure Patricia would drink. She tried to calm her racing heart by reminding herself that Patricia was just a person, just a woman who'd gotten attached to an idea about community and had let that attachment distort her judgment. Patricia arrived at 6 p.m., looking simultaneously exhausted and defensive. She was still impeccably dressed, a crisp white linen shirt and tailored navy pants, but her hair looked less perfect than usual, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made up suggested couldn't quite cover. Thank you for seeing me, Patricia said from Sarah's doorway, not stepping inside yet. Come in, Sarah said. They sat in Sarah's living room, the tea Sarah had made cooling on the coffee table between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Owe you an apology, Patricia said finally. Multiple apologies, actually, for the notices, for the escalation, for the way I handled everything. Did you escalate? Sarah asked. That's what I want to understand. You got a complaint about my chickens. That happens to HOAs all the time. Why did you make it a battle? Patricia looked down at her hands. Because you challenged me, she said quietly. That sounds petty, probably, but it's the truth. You got a lawyer. You sent me a letter basically telling me I was wrong, and instead of reconsidering my position, I dug in. I decided you were the problem, not my restriction, not my approach, but you specifically. You were a homeowner who thought she could do whatever she wanted, who didn't respect community, who was being selfish. That wasn't true, Sarah said. No, Patricia agreed. It wasn't. But by the time I realized that I'd already escalated things too far, I'd made it public. I'd gotten the board involved. I'd created this narrative where backing down looked like losing, looked like weakness. So I kept escalating instead, thinking if I just pushed hard enough, if I just showed you I was serious, you'd back down. You'd apologize and remove the chickens and admit that I was right. Never was going to do that, Sarah said. I know that now. Patricia finally looked up at her. Why? Because I was right, Sarah said simply. The county ordinance allows the chickens. Your restriction was unenforceable, and more than that, it was mean. It was you deciding what someone else should be allowed to do with their own property, and I had to draw a line somewhere. I had to stop letting other people's certainty override my own judgment. Patricia winced at that like it struck something deeper. I resigned, Patricia said. Did they tell you? Yes. I didn't resign because the board asked me to. I resigned because I couldn't look at myself anymore. I've been president of that HOA for 8 years. I pride myself on leadership, on community, on fairness. And what I did to you wasn't any of those things. It was the opposite. It was pettiness dressed up as principle. It was abuse of authority. It was wrong. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Sympathy, recognition that Patricia was suffering under the weight of having been revealed to herself and to her community as someone capable of that kind of behavior. I don't want you to lose your life over this, Sarah said quietly. I didn't start this to destroy you. I know, Patricia said. That's what's been haunting me all week. You didn't set out to hurt me, you just set out to stand up for yourself, and in doing so you exposed all the ways I've been willing to hurt others. You didn't do that, I did that, I'm doing that now, looking at myself clearly. They sat in silence for a while. What will you do? Sarah asked. After the HOA, I don't know, Patricia said. I've built my identity around that position. Around being the person who keeps things organized and under control. Without it, I'm not sure who I am. It's terrifying. Yeah, Sarah said, and she meant it. She'd spent 2 years finding out who she was without her marriage, without the identity of being someone's wife. She knew something about that particular terror. It is terrifying, but it's also kind of freeing. Patricia looked at her, and Sarah saw genuine curiosity in her expression. How? Because once you realize you're not who you thought you were, you get to decide who you actually want to be. That's harder, but it's also better, truer. Patricia nodded slowly. I think I need therapy, she said. Probably, Sarah agreed, and it was meant kindly. The follow-up news story ran on Channel 5's Evening News on Friday night. It showed the HOA board's formal apology, their withdrawal of all fines, and their announcement of a review of their restrictions to make sure they aligned with municipal code. It showed Sarah with her chickens, peaceful and vindicated. It showed the community center where the meeting had happened, and Marcus did a final stand-up where he reflected on what this case said about power, oversight, and the importance of knowing your rights. What it didn't show, because Patricia had requested privacy, was the conversation Sarah and Patricia had had. That remained private between the two of them, but word got out anyway, as things do. By Monday, the neighborhood was buzzing with the news that Sarah and Patricia had met, that they'd come to some kind of understanding. Sarah saw it in the way people approached her at the grocery store, with a kind of awed respect mixed with confusion. How had she forgiven Patricia? How was she so gracious? She wasn't particularly gracious, Sarah wanted to say. She just understood that destroying Patricia wouldn't make her own life better. That sometimes the strongest thing you could do was to allow someone else to be human, to make mistakes and suffer consequences and be given a chance to do better. What she didn't expect was the ripple effect. A woman named Helen Garrett called the house on Wednesday. She'd gotten Sarah's number from the neighborhood phone tree, apparently. Live over on Elm Street, Helen said. Our HOA president has been behaving the way yours did, you know, aggressive about rules, retaliatory when challenged, that kind of thing. I saw your story and I wondered if you'd be willing to talk to someone about starting to organize against it. We have other homeowners who are interested in pushing back. Sarah did talk to Helen, and she talked to 3 other people who called that week with similar situations. She realized that her case wasn't unique or unusual. It was just the one that had gone public. She didn't want to become an activist. But she also didn't feel like she could ignore these calls, couldn't pretend that what had happened to her wasn't happening to other people. So she started small. She offered to share her documentation, her legal counsel's contact information, her research on municipal ordinance. She offered to talk people through their situations. She offered what she'd learned, which was mainly that knowing your rights was half the battle, that having a lawyer was worth the cost, and that sometimes going public was the only leverage you had. She became, somewhat reluctantly, a resource. 6 weeks after the HOA board meeting, Sarah got a call from David Hartley, her attorney. Gotten 3 inquiries from HOAs in 3 different towns, David said, asking if their restrictions would hold up under similar challenges to yours. Apparently, your case is circulating among HOA legal consultants. You've created some awareness about the distinction between HOA authority and municipal code. That good? Sarah asked. It's very good, David said. I think you've contributed to a broader conversation about HOA overreach. That's valuable. I just wanted to keep my chickens, Sarah said. I know, David said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. But your wanting that, and your willingness to fight for it, is going to help other people keep other things. That's how change happens. Patricia called Sarah 3 months after the HOA meeting. She'd been going to therapy twice a week, she told Sarah. She was also, she said, reading about community leadership and ethics. She'd volunteered to work on a community mediation board, which was designed to help resolve disputes between neighbors before they escalated. I needed to find a way to be useful that doesn't involve control, Patricia said. Mediation felt like that. I'm not great at it yet, but I'm trying. Sarah listened and found that she was genuinely glad to hear it. Whatever they had been to each other, adversary, opponent, reflection of each other's worst impulses, they had moved into something more complicated and human. That sounds right, Sarah said. For you, I mean. How are you? Patricia asked. Are you happy? Yeah, Sarah said, and she meant it. I'm happy. The chickens are thriving. I've expanded my farmer's market business. I now have someone helping me bake because demand has gone up. Apparently people like supporting chicken ladies, and I'm dating someone. It's new, but he's nice and normal and he likes the chickens, which is important. Patricia laughed, a genuine, warm sound. That's good, she said. I'm glad. End of part 3. 2 years after the HOA meeting, The Meadowbrook Heights HOA board passed a new community ordinance explicitly permitting backyard poultry in compliance with county regulations. Sarah was invited to the board meeting where it passed. She brought her boyfriend, who had proposed to her 3 months earlier with a ring his grandmother had left him. Patricia Hallbrook still lived in Meadowbrook Heights. She never became president of the HOA again, but she became known as someone who could mediate conflicts carefully and fairly. Some people in the community still didn't like her. Some people thought she'd gotten away with her behavior. But most people agreed that she'd done the work to become better. Sarah's chickens had become legendary in the neighborhood. When they eventually, after 4 years, had to be retired from egg-laying and humanely euthanized, 30 people showed up at a small funeral Sarah held in her backyard. That wasn't about the chickens, exactly. It was about what they represented, the right to live on your own terms, to resist authority that overreached, to be seen and heard and not silenced. Part 4. The aftermath the year that followed Sarah's public victory was strange in ways she hadn't anticipated. The internet has a short attention span, and woman wins against HOA over chickens was the kind of story that got memed and then forgotten. Sarah found herself in the odd position of having been briefly internet famous for something that, in the grand scheme of human suffering and triumph, was relatively mundane. But mundane or not, the experience had changed her in ways that reverberated outward. She'd gone back to her freelance design work, but now her clients had heard about her. There was a strange phenomenon where people who'd seen her on the news wanted to work with her specifically, wanted to know the woman who'd stood up to an HOA. It was surreal and also incredibly helpful for her business. By September, she doubled her rates and was turning down projects because she didn't have capacity. Her dating life, which had been non-existent during the divorce and stilted for the first few years after, suddenly became active. She went on dates with men who'd seen her story and thought she was impressive. Most of them were disasters, men who were either intimidated by her or attracted to the idea of her rather than the reality. But then came Marcus, who was not Marcus from Channel 5, but a different Marcus entirely. A mathematics professor at the local university, quiet and thoughtful, who'd seen her story and been struck by her refusal to be quiet. He'd asked her out at the farmer's market, had come to her stand 3 weeks in a row before working up the courage, and when he finally said, "I'd like to take you to dinner, if you want." No pressure at all. Sarah had said yes not because she was lonely, but because she wanted to. Their first date was dinner at a Japanese restaurant, and they'd talked for 4 hours. He was recently divorced himself. His ex-wife had left him for someone from her work, and he'd spent 2 years not quite understanding how that had happened until his therapist pointed out that he'd spent their whole marriage being so focused on work that his wife had basically become invisible to herself in the relationship. He'd been doing the work, Marcus told Sarah, of trying to be more present, to not take people for granted. "I don't want to do that again," he said, and there was a vulnerability in it that Sarah recognized. "I don't want to be someone people have to leave to become visible again." "That's probably the healthiest thing I've heard a man say on a date," Sarah replied. 3 months later, Marcus asked her to move in with him. It was too fast, probably, but Sarah had learned that sometimes you had to trust your gut about people. And her gut told her that Marcus was kind and genuine and interested in actual partnership rather than comfort or control. They moved in together in December, a small house closer to the university, with room for her to expand her business. Marcus's daughter from his first marriage came for Christmas, a 16-year-old named Claire who was cautious about her father's new relationship, but who warmed up when Sarah didn't try too hard with her, didn't perform the role of new girlfriend trying to win over stepdaughter. She just existed around Claire, and that was apparently enough. Claire liked the idea of chickens, asked why they didn't get some. "We could," Sarah said. "If you want, there's space in the backyard. Could we actually do that?" Claire asked, surprised. "I thought there were probably rules." "There are rules," Sarah said. "But I got pretty good at understanding which rules are actually rules and which are just people trying to control things. Let me look into it." They could keep chickens. The city allowed them, and by spring, Claire's 3 chickens had moved into a coop in Sarah and Marcus's backyard, and Claire had become, in her own bored teenage way, invested in their care. But life wasn't all just personal happiness. The other inquiry calls kept coming. Sarah had tried to ignore them at first. She wasn't a lawyer, wasn't an activist, wasn't someone who had any business getting involved in other people's HOA disputes. But the calls kept coming, and with each one she heard echoes of her own experience. People being fined for minor violations, people being threatened, people being worn down by boards that had unilateral power and no oversight. By spring of the year after her case, Sarah had helped 17 people. Some of them won their cases. Some of them negotiated settlements. One of them, a woman named Dorothy in Cleveland, had actually got her entire HOA board to attend a community mediation training program after they tried to fine her $500 a month for having her grandchildren visit for more than 2 weeks at a time. Sarah hadn't been looking for this. But she'd also come to realize that she couldn't not do it. That once she knew her own power, once she understood that she could push back, that she could research, that she could go public, that she could win, she couldn't pretend she didn't have that knowledge when other people were suffering from the same abuse. In June, a documentary filmmaker named Jessica Chen reached out. No relation, but Sarah made a joke about it anyway. Jessica had seen Sarah's story and had become interested in the broader phenomenon of HOA overreach. She was putting together a documentary about 3 cases, Sarah's included, and she wanted to interview Sarah extensively. "I don't want to be exploited," Sarah said when they first talked. "I know," Jessica said. "That's why I'm telling you up front what I'm doing. I'm not interested in making people look foolish or making this into entertainment. I'm interested in the systems that allow one person to have power over many people with almost no accountability. Your case is one example of how that plays out." Sarah agreed to participate. The interviews took place over the course of September and October. Jessica was thorough and sensitive, asking Sarah not just about the chickens, but about the aftermath, about how it felt to be briefly internet famous, about what she'd learned about herself. "Did you know you were brave when you decided to fight?" Jessica asked during one interview, sitting in Sarah's living room with a camera and a thoughtful expression. "No," Sarah said. "I was angry and scared. I didn't feel brave. I felt like I was doing the only thing I could do without compromising myself completely. That's different from being brave." "How is it different?" "Brave feels like a choice," Sarah said. "Like you're doing something despite being afraid, but I felt like I wasn't choosing this, like it was something I had to do or I'd lose myself." "That's more like necessity than bravery." "The outcome was brave," Jessica said. "You changed things. You shifted how your community thinks about authority." "I shifted things because other people were willing to shift with me," Sarah said. Maria Rodriguez on the board, she was the one who actually questioned Patricia's reasoning. The cameraman was the one who pointed out that the HOA board meeting was public. "I didn't do this alone. I did it with a lot of help. I think that's important to say." "Why?" "Because if I accept all the credit, then other people think they can't do what I did unless they have some special quality I have. But I'm not special. I'm just a woman with a lawyer and chickens and the luck of having a board member who was willing to question authority. That luck should be available to everyone." By the time the documentary was completed and due to air, Sarah was 3 months pregnant. It wasn't planned. Sarah and Marcus had talked about it vaguely. They'd both been married before, both already had experienced that particular life transition, and while they weren't opposed to kids, they weren't actively trying either. But Sarah had missed her period in October, and 2 pregnancy tests later, she was pregnant with their biological child together. Marcus had cried when she told him, and not from fear or unhappiness, but from something that looked like gratitude. Like he'd been given a second chance at something he thought was in his past. "Are you happy?" he asked, holding her face in his hands the way he did when he wanted her full attention. "I'm terrified," Sarah said. "But yes, I'm happy." "Okay," he said. "Then we'll be okay." Documentary aired in January, a year and a half after Sarah's initial fight with the HOA. It was called The Fence Line, and it premiered at Sundance before getting picked up for limited theatrical release and then streaming distribution. Sarah didn't watch it until January 15th at an advanced screening with Marcus and Claire. She sat through it braced for herself to be portrayed inaccurately or unfairly, but Jessica had done her work well. Sarah came across as human, sometimes uncertain, sometimes angry, sometimes just trying to figure out what the right thing to do was. The film didn't make her out to be a hero. It made her out to be a person who'd been pushed too far and had pushed back. What surprised Sarah was how much the film focused on Patricia. Jessica had interviewed Patricia extensively, and in the documentary, Patricia's transformation was palpable. You could see the moment Patricia began to question her own authority, the moment she realized she'd been wrong. It was uncomfortable to watch, that kind of public reckoning with one's own failure. After the screening, Sarah asked Jessica if Patricia had consented to being portrayed so vulnerably. "She did," Jessica said. "She wanted people to see it. She wanted people to understand that this kind of abuse of authority doesn't come from evil people. It comes from scared people who grab onto control because they don't know who they are without it. That's not an excuse, but it's a context." "I think she felt like she needed to be portrayed that way," Sarah said. Like the only way she could keep going was if she was totally transparent about how she'd failed. "Probably," Jessica said. "Shame and guilt are powerful motivators, but so is the possibility of being seen as someone capable of change." documentary was a critical success. It won awards at Sundance, got good reviews in the national press, and sparked conversations about HOA accountability and reform in multiple states. Sarah received interview requests again, this time framed around the documentary rather than just her original case. She did a few of them carefully and then politely declined most. She was tired of talking about the chickens. She wanted to move forward. What she couldn't have predicted was what was about to happen. In March, 2 months into her pregnancy, Sarah got a phone call from a lawyer in Oregon. "My name is David Patterson," the man said. "I'm representing a homeowners association that would like to hire your consulting firm." "I don't have a consulting firm," Sarah said. "I'm a freelance graphic designer." "You do now," David said. "Or you could. We'd like to hire you and hire Jessica Chen, the filmmaker, to work with us on redesigning our community policies and governance structures. We've been following your case and the documentary, and we think what happened to you should serve as a model for how to avoid abuse of authority. We'd like to bring you in to help us rebuild our systems." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I don't have experience in HOA governance." "Neither do most people who end up running them," David said. "What you have is lived experience of the problem and a demonstrated commitment to fairness. That's worth more than any certification." "I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course." After they hung up, Sarah sat in her home office, a space that had once been a guest bedroom and was now outfitted with her work setup and a bassinet that Marcus had assembled despite her protests that she still had 2 months. She put her hand on her pregnant belly and tried to figure out if this was something she wanted to do. The truth was, she'd spent the past 18 months giving advice to people for free out of a sense of obligation. Turning it into paid work felt like it might make the obligation into something purposeful. It felt like it might be a way to systematize the help she'd been providing. She called Marcus at the university. "Someone wants to hire me to consult with HOAs on governance reform," she said without preamble. "In Oregon and potentially other places if it works out." "Okay," Marcus said. "How do you feel about that?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to do it because I think it matters. Part of me wants to be like, I just want a normal life. I don't want to be the HOA lady forever." "Those mutually exclusive?" Marcus asked. "What do you mean?" "You could do this and still have a normal life. You could bring our baby to the office sometimes. We could do this together, make it part of our life rather than something separate from it. You don't have to choose between fighting for change and having a normal life. You can do both." Sarah realized he was right. She'd been thinking of activism and personal happiness as opposing forces, when really they could be woven together. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to do it. Will you help me?" "Always," Marcus said. She called David Patterson back the next day and agreed to consult with his HOA. They flew to Portland in April, despite her doctor's advice about flying while pregnant. Jessica came with them, interested in documenting how an HOA might actually reform its systems based on the lessons from Sarah's case. The HOA board in Oregon, Clearwater Heights, had a president named Robert Chen, no relation, but again, Sarah made a joke who seemed genuine in his desire to change how the board operated. There was no Patricia in this situation, no person clinging desperately to authority. Instead, there was a group of volunteer board members who were overwhelmed and making decisions in ways that weren't fair or thoughtful. Over the course of a week, Sarah helped them redesign their governance structure. She worked with them on creating better communication channels, on establishing review processes before enforcement, on training for board members about HOA law and municipal code. She encouraged them to create a homeowner appeals process, to limit the fines any one board could levy, to make major decisions subject to homeowner vote. By the end of the week, the board had voted to implement a new system. It wasn't perfect, but it was a significant improvement over the systems that had allowed Patricia to behave the way she had. "Thank you," Robert Chen said at the end of the final day. "This matters. I know it's just boring governance stuff, but it actually affects people's lives. I'm glad you're doing this." Sarah flew home to Ohio exhausted and with heartburn and 6 weeks away from her due date. Their son was born in May. His name was James, after Marcus's grandfather. He was small and perfect, and he required the kind of focused attention that made it hard for Sarah to think about anything else. She didn't take on any new consulting projects that summer. She stayed home with James, learning how to be a mother, rebuilding her relationship with her own body after pregnancy and birth. It was grounding, after the whirlwind of the past year and a half. It was normal in the way she'd said she wanted. But by fall, when James was 4 months old and sleeping through the night, Sarah found herself thinking about the Oregon HOA again, wondering how the implementation was going, wondering if there was more work to be done. She started answering some of those inquiry emails again. She started doing consulting work from home, fitting it around James's schedule. She started saying yes to opportunities that felt aligned with her values. She'd found a way to make it work, the activism and the normal life. They weren't at odds. They were part of the same commitment to being honest and showing up and doing the work. End of part 4. By James's first birthday, Sarah's consulting practice had grown enough that she'd hired an assistant. She worked part-time while Marcus was home watching James, and they traded off responsibilities in a way that felt equitable. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA had become a model for other communities trying to reform their governance. Patricia Hallbrook had started writing a blog about HOA ethics and was being contacted by HOAs across the country for advice on cultural change. Sarah didn't think of herself as an activist. She thought of herself as someone who'd learned to push back against injustice and had discovered that when you did, other people pushed back with you. That's all it took. One person refusing to be quiet, and suddenly everyone else was allowed to be honest too. Part 5. The circle 5 years after the HOA notice first landed on Sarah's doormat, she stood in the backyard of her and Marcus's house and looked at the chickens. There were 6 of them now. Penny and Dimes were long gone, retired peacefully after their egg-laying years had naturally concluded. But Nicole and Quarters were still producing eggs reliably. And then there were the newer additions, Bea, Margaret, and Tabitha, named by Claire when she was 17 and going through a period where she named everything after old Hollywood actresses. James, now 5 years old, was collecting eggs in a small basket with his father. He took the responsibility very seriously, insisting on checking with the chickens first to see if they were comfortable with him taking their eggs. "You have to ask permission," James had told Sarah when he was 3, and Claire had laughed that he was the only person she knew who understood consent on a preschool level. "The eggs are for the chickens, but they share them with us because they love us." Sarah wasn't sure if that was how chicken reproduction actually worked, but the philosophy was sound. She was 38 years old. She had a 5-year-old son and a 16-year-old stepdaughter who was applying to colleges. She had a husband who made her coffee every morning. She had a consulting practice that was growing. She had chickens. She'd had all of this in various forms 5 years ago when Patricia Hallbrook had sent the first notice. But she'd also had panic. She'd had the sense that everything could be taken away at any moment. She'd had the feeling that other people's authority mattered more than her own judgment. That feeling was gone. Patricia Hallbrook called that day March 15th, the 5-year anniversary of the initial notice. They did this now, called each other on this day, an acknowledgement of the anniversary that both of them understood the significance of. "Hi," Patricia said when Sarah answered. "I'm calling from Portland." "You're in Portland?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I moved here 6 months ago," Patricia said. "You knew that, right?" "I told you." "No, I don't think you did," Sarah said. "What's in Portland?" "A position," Patricia said. "Working with a nonprofit that specializes in HOA accountability and reform. They found me through the documentary, actually. They liked what I'd said about needing to build systems of accountability rather than just hopping people will be ethical. Turns out there are a lot of people thinking about these issues." "Patricia, that's wonderful," Sarah said, and she meant it. Patricia had spent the 5 years after her resignation working through her own issues, going to therapy, volunteering on community boards, and trying to understand what had driven her to behave the way she had. It had been a long journey, and Sarah had watched it from a distance, staying in occasional touch but maintaining appropriate boundaries. "I wanted to tell you in person," Patricia said, "but I'm also calling to tell you something else. I've been asked to speak at a national conference on HOA governance. They want me to talk about how I handled the aftermath of the case, the accountability part, but they also want you to speak about your part of it. Would you be interested?" Sarah's first instinct was to say no. She'd spent 5 years actively avoiding being the public face of her story. She deflected interviews, declined speaking invitations, tried to move forward into a normal life. But something about Patricia asking made it different. "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course," Patricia said. "But Sarah, I want to tell you something first. What I did, what I'm still working on, is understanding that leadership isn't about being right. It's about being accountable. And you held me accountable when no one else would. You made me see myself clearly. I hated it at the time, but I'm grateful for it now." After they hung up, Sarah sat on her porch and watched Marcus and James with the chickens. James was laughing at something, probably Nicole, who always seemed to find new ways to be comedic while doing absolutely nothing. She thought about what Patricia had said about leadership and accountability. She thought about all the people she'd helped over the past 5 years, the 17 people from her original surge of consulting, and then the dozens more as word spread, as the documentary reached more people, as her reputation solidified into something bigger than herself. She thought about the fact that she'd never actually wanted any of this. She just wanted to keep her chickens. But wanting something simple and being willing to fight for it had changed her community, had changed people she'd never met because they'd found her case and been inspired to push back against their own situations. That was the ripple effect. That was what happened when one person refused to be quiet. She called the conference organizers and said yes. The conference was held in Washington, D.C. in September. It was called Building Better Communities, HOA Governance and Accountability, and it brought together HOA board members, homeowners who'd had conflicts with HOAs, lawyers specializing in HOA law, and policymakers interested in potentially reforming HOA regulations at the state level. Sarah and Patricia were on the same panel, titled Conflict as Catalyst: How Disputes Lead to Systemic Change. Sarah had prepared remarks, but she'd also prepared to be nervous. Speaking in front of 300 people was different than speaking to local news. It was bigger and more official, and more like her actual words were going to matter in measurable ways. Patricia went first. She talked about her own journey, about the realization that she'd been using authority as a substitute for self-worth, about the work she'd done to understand her own patterns. She didn't minimize what she'd done or make excuses, but she also contextualized it in a way that made it clear that she wasn't inherently evil. She was just a person who'd gotten scared and had grabbed onto control. What I want to say, Patricia concluded, is that systems change not when we get better leaders, but when we build structures that don't depend on leaders being perfect. Sarah didn't change things by being extraordinary. She changed things by refusing to play by unfair rules and by finding advocates. A lawyer, a news crew, eventually a filmmaker, who made her story impossible to ignore. We can't rely on homeowners being willing to fight back. We have to build systems that prevent HOAs from having that kind of unchecked power in the first place. When Sarah took the microphone, she felt calm in a way she hadn't expected. "I didn't come here to be a hero," she said. "I came here because someone asked me to speak, and I've learned that when you have a platform, even if you didn't ask for it, you have a responsibility to use it. So I'm going to tell you what I learned from my experience, which is that most people in authority aren't inherently bad. They're just scared and trying to hold on to control. And most people being subjected to that authority aren't trying to be rebels. They're just trying to live their lives. Conflict between me and the Meadowbrook Heights HOA didn't need to happen. It happened because no one was willing to say, wait, let me actually think about whether this rule makes sense. It happened because the system made it easier to escalate than to reconsider. What I've learned working with dozens of HOAs over the past 5 years is that when you change the system, when you require consultation before enforcement, when you create appeals processes, when you limit the power any individual has, people generally make better decisions, not perfect decisions, but better ones. I got lucky. I had a lawyer. I had access to media. I had a support system. Most people don't have all those things. So we need to build systems where you don't have to be lucky to be treated fairly, where the rules work for everyone, not just the people in charge. After the panel, people lined up to talk to Sarah. Some of them were people she'd consulted with before. Some of them were people who'd heard about her case and had been inspired to fight their own situations. Some of them were board members wanting to understand how to do better. One woman in her 70s with kind eyes and a firm grip took Sarah's hand after everyone else had gone. "Thank you," the woman said, "for all of it, especially for not staying quiet." "Almost did," Sarah said, "but you didn't," the woman said, "and that mattered more than you probably know." Documentary, by then, had won multiple awards. Jessica Chen had gone on to make 2 more films about systemic abuse of authority, one about landlord-tenant disputes, one about corporate workplace power dynamics. Sarah had been interviewed for the second film, talking about how the chickens case had taught her to recognize patterns of power imbalance in other systems. Life had become, in many ways, quite normal. Sarah worked from home or from coffee shops. She took James to preschool. He was in kindergarten now, advanced for his age in reading but delightfully average at social skills. He still tried to ask permission to take other people's food. She and Marcus had fallen into a rhythm that felt genuinely sustainable, where they both had careers and parenting happened together rather than falling disproportionately on one person. Claire had gone to Stanford to study environmental policy. She still came home for holidays and sent her dad photos of her dorm room where she had a small succulent that she'd named Survivor, which was very Claire. The Meadowbrook Heights community had changed significantly. With new HOA leadership and new policies, there'd been a shift in tone. The community felt less punitive and more collaborative. Jennifer Walsh, one of the board members who'd voted with Maria Rodriguez to question Patricia's escalation, had become the new president and had brought a more thoughtful approach to governance. Sarah still occasionally visited Meadowbrook Heights to see her old house, which she passed occasionally when she was in the area. The new owners had kept the chicken coop. They had 3 chickens of their own. In December of James's kindergarten year, Sarah got a call from a state legislator in Ohio. "We're considering introducing a bill that would require HOAs to have more robust appeal processes and would limit unilateral enforcement power," Representative Sarah Martinez said. "I've been reading your case, and I wanted to know if you'd be willing to testify before our committee about your experience." Sarah agreed. The testimony happened in February, in a room full of legislators and community advocates and HOA representatives. Sarah told her story again. She'd told it many times now. The narrative had become smooth and practiced. But what made this different was that she was telling it to people with the power to actually change things at a policy level. She brought photos of her chicken coop. She brought her legal documentation. She brought the letter Patricia had written, and the letter Patricia had written later as an apology. She brought it all, and she laid it out as clearly as she could, showing exactly where the system had failed and where there were obvious opportunities for reform. The bill passed committee. It went to the full legislature. It passed with bipartisan support. Ohio became one of 3 states that year to enact new HOA accountability legislation. Other states followed. What had started as one woman's frustration about being fined for chickens had become part of a broader movement toward systemic reform. Sarah didn't think of herself as an activist, but she also couldn't pretend that her visibility and her willingness to share her story hadn't mattered. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA invited her to speak at their annual meeting in the 5th year after her case. Sarah brought Marcus and James. Patricia was there too, which would have been strange and awkward 5 years ago, but now it felt almost natural. They'd been through something together, and while it had been adversarial at first, they'd both emerged from it better. Patricia introduced Sarah to the community, talking about how that early conflict had, paradoxically, saved the HOA from becoming something worse. "Sarah forced us to become better," Patricia said, and there was no irony or resentment in her voice, just honesty. When Sarah spoke, she talked about the importance of community. She talked about the way fear and power imbalance could distort even well-intentioned communities. She talked about what it looked like when people chose to listen to each other instead of just to their own certainty. Afterward, people came up to her, some of the same neighbors who'd made complaints 5 years ago. Robert Hutchins, who'd been on the board and had eventually voted to support Maria's reconsideration. Margaret Voss, the interior designer who'd complained about the aesthetics of the coop. They both told her in different ways that they'd been wrong, that they'd learned something from the whole situation. "I was scared the community was going downhill," Margaret said, "and I took that fear out on you. I'm sorry." "I know," Sarah said, "and I forgive you." She meant it. That night, after James was asleep and Marcus was reading in bed, Sarah went to the window of the house she'd lived in for 12 years and no longer owned. The lights of the community were soft and warm. The neighborhood looked like what it was, a place where people lived and worked and tried to figure things out together. She thought about the version of herself from 5 years ago, terrified and shaking with a notice in her hand, convinced her life was going to be destroyed over 4 backyard chickens. She thought about the choices that woman had made. To hire a lawyer to push back, to go public, to refuse to be quiet. She thought about the ripple effects that single act of resistance had created. She thought about Patricia, transformed by being held accountable. She thought about the homeowners in other communities who'd been inspired to fight their own battles. She thought about the legislation that had been passed. She thought about the norms that had slowly shifted toward fairness and accountability. None of that would have happened if she just removed the chickens and accepted the fine. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked from the bed. "Much can change from one small decision," Sarah said. "Which decision?" "The one to not be quiet," Sarah said. "The one to push back. I still don't think of myself as brave for doing it, but it was the right thing." "It was," Marcus said. "Come to bed." End of Part 5. 10 years after the initial notice, Meadowbrook Heights had become known as a model community for balanced HOA governance. Sarah Chen was running a successful consulting firm with clients across 4 states. Patricia Hallbrook had become a nationally recognized advocate for HOA reform. And in the yards of Meadowbrook Heights, where it had all begun, chickens clucked contentedly, the simple and ordinary symbols of one woman's refusal to be controlled. The news story, which had seemed so dramatic 5 years earlier, had become the foundation of something larger than anyone had anticipated. A movement toward fairness, accountability, and the radical idea that ordinary people deserve to make decisions about their own lives without permission from people who believed they knew better. Epilogue, 20 years later, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the house she'd owned for 10 years now. A different house, bigger with more land, and watched her 14-year-old son collect eggs from 8 chickens. James did this every morning before school, had done it consistently for the past 6 years, and had developed a genuine expertise in chicken husbandry that had embarrassed his mother more than once when he'd corrected a veterinarian about proper coop ventilation. He was heading to a summer program at an agricultural college, determined to study sustainable urban farming. He'd already spent 2 summers volunteering with organizations that promoted backyard poultry and community gardens in urban areas. Claire, now 31, had become an environmental policy advisor and had worked on several significant pieces of legislation related to land use and urban agriculture. She often referenced in professional settings the time her father's then-girlfriend had fought an HOA over chickens. "My family was basically an accidental activist cell," she liked to say, "all because of poultry." Sarah was 48 years old. She'd been married to Marcus for 8 years, and they'd just bought a second home in Portland, where they were considering retiring eventually. Her consulting firm had offices in 4 states. She'd written a book about HOA governance that had been used in university courses. She'd spoken to state legislatures and policymakers and community organizations across the country. But she still thought of herself, first and foremost, as someone who kept chickens. The documentary, The Fence Line, had been added to the Library of Congress's film collection as a significant cultural artifact. Jessica Chen had become a prominent filmmaker, and she'd started a nonprofit dedicated to using documentary as a tool for social change. She'd attributed her entire career trajectory to meeting Sarah at that initial HOA hearing. Patricia Hallbrook had written a memoir titled Beyond Authority, Finding Purpose After Power. It had been well reviewed and had become required reading in some business schools' courses on ethical leadership. She was still volunteering with community organizations, still doing mediation work, still living in Portland. She and Sarah had dinner together once a month, and while it wasn't quite friendship, there was still something between them from those early days. It was something genuine and mutually respectful. Sarah had been invited to speak at the Meadowbrook Heights HOA's 20th anniversary celebration of The Incident, as people had started calling it. The Incident. Like it was a historical event, which in a weird way it had become, she'd declined the speaking invitation. She'd learned over the years that she didn't need to be the narrator of her own story anymore, that the story had become bigger than her. But she sent a letter to be read at the event. 20 years ago, I received a notice that changed my life. Not because it was inherently significant, but because I decided not to accept it quietly. I decided to push back to research, to find help, to eventually go public. Looking back, I don't think I was being brave. I think I was being honest about what I needed and was willing to fight for it. What I didn't know then was that my honesty would create room for other people to be honest too. That a community could shift from fear-based governance to trust-based governance if someone was willing to push against the fear. To the people in Meadowbrook Heights who took a chance on that shift, who voted to reconsider, who were willing to change, thank you. You could have doubled down. You could have defended Patricia or forced me out. Instead, you chose a harder path, the path of actually thinking about whether rules made sense. That choice, repeated across communities, across decades, is how systems change. I still have chickens. I'll probably always have chickens. Not because they're particularly special birds, but because they represent something to me. The right to live on your own terms, to make choices about your own property, to not have to ask permission from people who believe they know better. Thank you for 20 years of honoring that right in your community. Sincerely. Sarah Chen. The thing that surprised Sarah the most, looking back, was how ordinary everything had turned out to be. She'd expected her life to be completely different after the news coverage, after the documentary, after the broader involvement with HOA reform. But what had actually happened was slower and quieter. She just kept living her life, kept her job, kept her family, kept her chickens, and gradually, over years, the work she'd done had compounded. Small change after small change had accumulated into something larger. It wasn't a movie ending where the heroine learned a profound lesson and transformed overnight. It was a real life, where the journey took decades, and where the impact was incremental, and where sometimes you forgot what you'd done that had mattered until someone referenced it years later. That was the actual story of courage, Sarah realized. Not the moment of decision, not the dramatic confrontation, but the years afterward where you just keep showing up and doing the work and letting other people be changed by what you changed in yourself. On a Tuesday afternoon in April, Sarah got a call from a 17-year-old girl named Sophia who lived in Phoenix. "I'm in an HOA dispute," Sophia said without preamble, "and someone told me about your case. I was wondering if I'd be able to talk to you about what to do." Sarah had received hundreds of calls like this over the past 20 years. Most of them she directed to lawyers or to the nonprofit organizations that had been created specifically to help with HOA issues. But sometimes she talked to people herself. "Tell me what's happening," Sarah said. Fia's situation was different but also heartbreakingly familiar. She and her mother were being fined by their HOA for her mother's disability modifications to their house. The HOA was claiming the ramp violated community aesthetics standards. The modifications were required under the Americans with Disabilities Act, making the HOA's position obviously illegal, but the board was being stubborn and difficult anyway. "It's probably going to go to litigation," Sarah said. "You're going to need a lawyer, but I want to tell you something. You're right and they're wrong. The law is on your side. The fairness is on your side. And if you're willing to push back, you have a good chance of winning." "You scared?" Sophia asked. "When you did this," terrified, Sarah said, "I was scared that I'd make things worse, that I'd lose my home, that I'd become the neighborhood villain. All of those things could have happened." "They didn't," Sarah said. "They didn't. And I learned that sometimes the things you're most afraid of are the things that need to happen anyway. That fear isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it's a sign you're doing something that matters." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her home office and thought about how many conversations like this she'd had over 2 decades. How many people had called asking if they should fight back. How many of them had actually done it. She thought about the original notice from Patricia 20 years ago. She could probably still find it if she dug through the files. She'd moved it around to different houses, kept it as a kind of talisman or reminder of that moment when she decided to be honest about what she needed. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "Do you want to go get chickens?" she asked. "We already have 8 chickens," Marcus said, which was a fair point. "Do you want to help me get more?" There was a pause. Then, "Are you okay?" "Yes," Sarah said. "I'm just thinking about how much has come from not being willing to be quiet, and I'm grateful. I want to do something to mark that." "Could do something quiet," Marcus suggested. "We don't always have to do something big." Sarah smiled. "You're right, but we could get a few more chickens anyway, and maybe James could help, and maybe we could see if Sophia needs our help fighting her HOA." "Okay," Marcus said in the tone of someone who knew that his wife had just identified her next mission and there was no stopping her. "We'll get more chickens. We'll help Sophia. We'll